During the Permian period, before the rise of the dinosaurs, the dominant animals were synapsids, the branch of animals more closely related to mammals than to reptiles. Although true mammals wouldn't exist for some time, the synapsids alive during the Late Permian were already rather mammal-like, possessing partially upright limbs, specialized teeth, high metabolisms, and potentially even fur. Synapsid diversity crashed at the end of the Permian period 252 million years ago due to a mass extinction event called the Great Dying. Caused by a period of extreme volcanism which released numerous greenhouse gases, such as CO2 and methane, into the atmosphere, the Great Dying was the most severe extinction event the animal kingdom has ever seen, and it left the world's ecosystems devastated to a degree not even matched by the meteor that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. Ironically, the ecological gaps created by the Great Dying provided the opportunity for the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodilians to initially diversify. However, during the first few million years after the cataclysm, the world was still primarily dominated by surviving Permian holdovers. Among these survivors was a surprisingly sizable synapsid carnivore named Moschorhinus. About 1.5 meters long, this stocky proto-mammal is thought to have hunted in a manner similar to modern big cats, and was one of the top predators during the dawn of the Triassic Period, the first period of the time that would be known as the Age of Reptiles. All Moschorhinus fossils on both sides of the Permian-Triassic boundary originate from the South African Karoo supergroup. A diverse assortment of basal synapsids are found in the late Permian rocks, but after the Great Dying, there were only 3 remaining clades of synapsids. The most successful were an unusual group of tusked herbivores called dicynodonts. Thanks to the near total lack of surviving competition, the dicynodont genus Lystrosaurus became the most successful herbivore of all time during the Early Triassic. Some smaller, gopher-like dicynodonts, such as Myosaurus, also survived to see the beginning of the Mesozoic Era. A more familiar group of Triassic synapsids were the cynodonts, which were initially small carnivores and insectivores. This is the group that would eventually give rise to mammals, and basal cynodonts already looked very similar to them. Moschorhinus instead belonged to Therocephalia, the third group of surviving synapsids, and the closest relatives of the cynodonts. They looked nearly as mammal-like as the contemporary cynodonts, to a degree that non-specialists could easily mistake one for the other. Therocephalians had been large predators during the Middle Permian, but only small, derived species survived the Capitanian mass extinction event, which heralded the start of the Late Permian. For most of the Late Permian, Therocephalians were stuck as the underdogs of the more familiar Gorgonopsians, who had ironically been their underdogs during the Middle Permian. Therocephalia's fortune began to change during the end of the Late Permian, when it saw some Therocephalians once again obtain large body size. Many of these new carnivores, such as Megawattsia, perished during the Great Dying, but Moschorhinus and a few other members of its subclade of Therocephalia, Echidnonathidae, endured. The other known survivors are Oliverosuchus, Zorillodontops, and Promoschorhinus. While Moschorhinus was at the top of the food chain, these smaller echidnonathids were the medium-sized predators of the depleted early Triassic ecosystems. Some small Therocephalians also survived, including insectivores and even herbivores. Named in 1920, Moschorhinus means calf nose on account of its broad snout. While several species of Moschorhinus have been named over the years, the only one officially recognized as valid is Moschorhinus kitcheni, which was named after James Kitching, the man who found the holotype. Some other Therocephalian taxa, such as Scaminosaurus warreni and Tigrisuchus, have recently turned out to be synonymous with Moschorhinus. Many of these were named earlier than Moschorhinus was, with Tigrisuchus being named as far back as 1876, so under normal circumstances, the name Moschorhinus would not have priority. However, it has benefited from a loophole added to the ICZN. Basically, if the older taxonomic name has been out of use for a sufficient amount of time, and the newer one has been used extensively, it can retain its validity. This exception was created to preserve the name Tyrannosaurus rex, as it turned out that the fragmentary and older species Manospondylus gigas might be synonymous with it. In any event, this addition to the ICZN has also avoided a great deal of confusion regarding Moschorhinus' name. With a length of about 1.5 meters, Moschorhinus was only a medium-sized predator during the Permian period, being the leopard to the Gorgonopsians' lion or bear. Indeed, the largest complete specimen is estimated to have weighed the same as a large male leopard. The Moschorhinus individuals found in Triassic rocks are slightly smaller than their Permian ancestors, but they were by far the largest predators remaining in South Africa at the start of the period. Moschorhinus was also much more deadly than its size would imply. It was heavily built compared to the other local medium-sized predators, which were primarily the smaller species of Gorgonopsians. Unlike these more gracile carnivores, Moschorhinus had robust shoulder blades, humeri, and femurs, which provided space for the powerful muscles needed to overpower its prey. While its modern analogs, felines, have smaller skulls than most other carnivorous mammals, Therocephalians like Moschorhinus had disproportionately large skulls. Even though a lion was much heavier than Moschorhinus, their skulls actually overlap in size. Its skull was also robust, with a wide, deep shape and the broadest lower jaw found within Therocephalia. The temporal fenestrae, openings at the top of the skull, had expanded dramatically, providing space for enlarged jaw muscles. Moschorhinus' wide, broad snout was short for Therocephalian, although it was longer than those of analogous felines. Like modern mammals, the teeth of Moschorhinus were heterodont, meaning they came in several different shapes. Those at the front of the snout were laterally compressed incisors. Unlike the incisors of its relatives, these teeth lacked signs of wear. Behind them were large, round canines. Described within the scientific literature as being shaped like railroad spikes, these were Moschorhinus' primary killing tools. Much like big cats, they are thought to have used them to clamp down on their victim's throat until they died from suffocation. Moschorhinus' canines were longer than those of modern felines, and were as long as the saber teeth of many contemporary Gorgonopsians, to the extent that openings in its palate evolved to accommodate the lower pair of canines. Moschorhinus had only one set of canines, while earlier Therocephalians had two. Moschorhinus also lacked the small, simple, palatal teeth that were present in more basal Therocephalians, and had been common among more basal synapsids. Right behind the canines were a few small postcanines. Such teeth were typically used when feeding, but due to their reduced size and number relative to other Therocephalians, it seems their role was largely supplanted by the incisors. They are thought to have been used to tear off small bits of flesh that were then swallowed whole, a strategy that may have produced few tooth marks on the bones of its prey. Besides Gorgonopsians, during the Permian period, Moschorhinus also coexisted with an unusually large basal cynodont called Vetusodon. Competition between the two was likely even more intense than with the Gorgonopsians, as Vetusodon's short, broad skull was evolutionarily convergent with Moschorhinus's. Vetusodon was about the same size as Triassic Moschorhinus, but was smaller than the contemporary Permian specimens. There is a misconception that Moschorhinus was venomous, which is how it was portrayed in BBC's Walking with Monsters. Some paleontologists hold that this was the case for the Permian echidnathid Euchambersia, although this hypothesis remains controversial. In any event, the relevant traits have never been found in Moschorhinus. Likewise, a venomous bite would have been unnecessary during the Triassic period. Moschorhinus was larger than the surviving species of Lystrosaurus. Its stocky body was perfect to grapple it, and its heavily built skull was already capable of delivering a powerful, conventional bite. As in other early synapsids, Moschorhinus' legs were held in a semi-erect gait, so it would not have been as fast as big cats. However, the same was true of its prey, with the first fully upright limbs evolving later during the Triassic period. The limb bones of Triassic Moschorhinus are even more robust than those dating to the Permian period, but the functional and evolutionary implications of this have so far remained unexplored. Indeed, despite how long it has been known to science, Moschorhinus' postcranial skeleton wasn't described in the scientific literature until 2024. Besides being suited for overpowering prey, Moschorhinus' powerful limb muscles would have also made it a skilled burrower. A burrow from the earliest Triassic has even been attributed to it. It contains the skeleton of a juvenile Lystrosaurus, but it is too small to have been the burrow's maker. Likewise, Dicynodont burrows, including contemporaneous ones attributed to Lystrosaurus, are long and coil-like, while the Moschorhinus burrow is instead straight and simple. This shape is typical of burrows belonging to carnivores, as well as the early cynodont Thrinaxodon. As the site dates to the earliest Triassic, Moschorhinus is the only candidate large enough to have made a burrow of this shape and size. The Lystrosaurus skeleton is disarticulated, and is believed to have been dragged into the burrow and then fed upon by its resident Moschorhinus, not unlike how modern big cats often move their kills to safe locations. The Lystrosaurus skeleton lacks tooth marks, but this is consistent with Moschorhinus' proposed feeding strategy. Its ability to burrow may have also been part of the reason Moschorhinus survived the Great Dying. Because of the greenhouse gases unleashed by the volcanoes, the world rapidly experienced extreme global warming. High levels of methane, which had been both released by the volcanoes themselves and produced by microorganisms that flourished in the now CO2-rich atmosphere, depleted the ozone layer. The ability to seek shelter in burrows would have provided refuge from the scorching heat and ultraviolet radiation. Its tendency for living in burrows also seems to have predisposed Moschorhinus to survive another of the Great Dying's many killers. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere crashed as a result of the volcanic gases, dropping to nearly half of their previous level, while CO2 levels rose. While catastrophic for much of the Permian fauna, the respiratory systems of animals that lived in burrows were already adapted for such conditions. Indeed, most of the survivors in terrestrial ecosystems seem to have either been burrowers, like Moschorhinus, or to have been semi-aquatic. Another trait that unites the survivors is a high metabolism. The synapsids of the Late Permian had higher metabolic rates than most reptiles, and those that lived to see the dawn of the Triassic tended to have the highest metabolisms of all. Moschorhinus was no exception to this rule, but this in of itself makes it an exception within Therocephalia. While metabolic rates tended to decrease over the course of Therocephalia's evolution, Moschorhinus' metabolism matches that of the more active, basal Therocephalians like Skylacosaurus. Higher metabolisms allow for higher growth rates, and the ability to rapidly reach adulthood is thought to have been highly advantageous in the chaotic environments created by the extreme volcanism. Metabolism also played a major role in which animals survived the next two mass extinctions, albeit for completely different reasons. During the end-Triassic mass extinction, volcanoes released ash and sulfate gases into the atmosphere, creating volcanic winters that lasted up to a decade. Animals with higher metabolisms, like dinosaurs, were less reliant on the external environment to maintain their body temperatures, and were thus able to endure the suddenly colder climate. As such, essentially all of the large terrestrial animals remaining at the end of the Triassic were dinosaurs, laying the groundwork for their dominance during the rest of the Mesozoic Era. During the Cretaceous mass extinction, the far greater ash created by the meteor outright prevented sunlight from reaching the surface, temporarily halting almost all primary productivity in the world's ecosystems. Animals with lower metabolisms, like crocodilians, had a higher survival rate since they didn't need as much food as more active animals like dinosaurs did. This extinction was, more or less, a single, discrete event, while the volcanic winters at the close of the Triassic were rare, if devastating, blimps in a time that was otherwise experiencing global warming. Unlike these mass extinctions, the Permian mass extinction lasted for an extended period of time, perhaps 50,000 years, with a particularly severe stage lasting 20,000 years. This meant that the initial survivors had time to evolve in response to the mass extinction as it was ongoing. In Moschorhinus' case, besides its smaller body size, examination of its bone histology has revealed that its already high growth rate also changed in response to the world's deteriorating conditions. During the Permian, it took several years for it to reach adulthood, with its growth occurring in annual cycles. After the Great Dying, Moschorhinus grew much faster and at a more continuous rate, only to reach just about 80% of its previous body size. The ability to reach adulthood quickly had been why Moschorhinus survived when so many other creatures perished, and this trait continued to be selected for after the mass extinction. The bone histology of Permian and Triassic Lystrosaurus displays a similar trend. The same pattern has also been observed between species of modern desert tortoise. Species that live in more stressful and highly seasonal environments, like the Mojave Desert, have higher growth rates and smaller body sizes than their close relatives. This allows for them to better take advantage of the, relatively, good times, and is ultimately less energetically expensive than growing slowly over several years. The other echidnognathed Therocephalians that survived into the Triassic possessed many of the same adaptations that made Moschorhinus predisposed to survive the extreme conditions at the end of the Permian period. However, Moschorhinus's larger size created an additional challenge for it not faced by its smaller cousins like Oliverosuchus. Besides surviving the direct effects of the Great Dying, it also needed large prey animals to persist along with it to avoid starvation. Moschorhinus's salvation turned out to be Lystrosaurus, another burrower with a relatively high metabolism. Lystrosaurus was also uniquely suited to endure another challenge created by the Great Dying. The Permian mass extinction didn't just affect animals, but plants as well, to such a degree that coal formation ceased entirely during the disaster and its aftermath. However, horsetails remained relatively abundant due to their hardened exterior offering them protection from the increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation. While not the most palatable flora, Lystrosaurus's powerful beak allowed it to exploit such tough plants. While the largest species, Lystrosaurus maccaji, died out, the smaller Lystrosaurus curvatus proved sufficient for Moschorhinus's needs. This provides another explanation for why Triassic Moschorhinus were smaller than those from the Permian, as they didn't need to grow so large to hunt the remaining herbivores. This cat-like protomammal had achieved the impossible. It had survived the worst recorded mass extinction, reclaimed the niche of apex predator from the Gorgonopsians, and was now the sole large predator in South Africa, and likely much of the world. This seemingly put it in the perfect position to found a dynasty of predators to rule the new era. Moschorhinus then proceeded to unceremoniously die out just 160,000 years later. Unlike the extinction that would later bring about the end of the Age of Reptiles, life on land wouldn't recover until several million years after the Great Dying, with the coal gap continuing well into the Early Triassic. Likewise, the climate was prone to droughts, which is why rapid growth rates continued to be selected for after the end of the Permian. Moschorhinus's apparent demise coincides with the disappearance of other species in what appears to have been a smaller, second wave of extinctions. These include Lystrosaurus curvatus, although it may have simply split into Lystrosaurus declivus and Lystrosaurus murray. Besides the possible loss of its favorite prey, at the time of its disappearance, Moschorhinus was also no longer the sole large predator in the region. During the Permian period, Russia was inhabited by Archosaurus, the oldest known medium-sized predatory reptile. Between the Great Dying and the second, smaller extinction event, a close relative and possible descendant of Archosaurus, named Ferocious, arrived in South Africa. Unlike Moschorhinus, this reptile had grown larger than its Permian ancestors, with its head growing larger still to further increase its killing power. Ferocious is considered by some paleontologists to have been semi-aquatic, which potentially offered it a greater resource pool than Moschorhinus had. This was a clear advantage given the often turbulent early Triassic climate, particularly during the second wave of extinctions. It is possible that Ferocious simply got lucky, but in any event, the disappearance of Moschorhinus and the triumph of Ferocious proved to be very bad for Synapsida as a whole. Ferocious was part of a group of reptiles ancestral to the Archosaurs, the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodilians. It was the archosaurs which would almost entirely replace the large synapsids during the late Triassic, and completely overshadow the remaining small species during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. During the Middle Triassic, between Moschorhinus' extinction and the rise of the archosaurs, a few synapsids managed to recover some of the large predatory niches from the reptiles. Most, perhaps all, of these new carnivores were not Therocephalians, but instead the more mammal-like cynodonts. One of these, Cynognathus, was larger than Moschorhinus, even though it was smaller than many of the new reptilian carnivores. While Moschorhinus had hunted in a manner like today's big cats, Cynognathus instead hunted more like modern wolves. The success of Cynognathus demonstrates an important difference between cynodonts and Therocephalians. The Therocephalians which survived into the early Triassic were initially more diverse than cynodonts or dicynodonts, although they were less abundant than the latter. However, while perhaps as few as 2 species of cynodonts were left at the start of the Triassic, they were quick to diversify, while the Therocephalians stagnated. They had been well equipped to survive the Great Dying, but were seemingly not as well suited to take advantage of the new Triassic world. With fewer new species, every additional extinction was a major blow to the dwindling clade. The predatory echinognathids are generally thought to have disappeared entirely before the end of the early Triassic, which only lasted 5 million years. The smaller insectivorous and herbivorous Therocephalians, called Burrows, lasted longer, but they seem to have disappeared before the close of the Middle Triassic. Rather than being outcompeted by archosaurs and their relatives, the Burrows seem to have instead been replaced by their more evolutionarily dynamic cynodont cousins. There is one fossil of a large Therocephalian from the Middle Triassic that may alter the current picture of Therocephalia's decline. Originating from Antarctica, it is nearly as large as corresponding elements of Moschorhinus, and might belong to a late surviving echinognathed. While fragmentary, it is evidence that Moschorhinus might have lasted longer than traditionally thought. There is a substantial degree of overlap between the fauna of early Triassic Antarctica and Moschorhinus' native South Africa, and while Moschorhinus fossils have yet to be identified from the frozen continent, the available material there is much more limited than in the Kauru supergroup. It is conceivable that rather than going extinct, Moschorhinus' range was merely reduced during the second wave of extinctions. So Moschorhinus might have inhabited Antarctica. It might have survived there after dying out in South Africa. So the large, Middle Triassic Therocephalian fossil, which might belong to an echinognathed, might be its direct descendant. On the other hand, that is a lot of mites. Alternatively, it could have instead been the descendant of one of Moschorhinus' smaller relatives, or have even been an unusually large Burrowoid. Even if a relic population persisted in Antarctica, the disappearance of Moschorhinus from South Africa and its replacement by Proterosuchus was a major turning point in Earth's evolutionary history. The usurpation of the synapsids by the archosaurs was more gradual than the replacement of the dinosaurs by mammals during the Cenozoic Era, but Moschorhinus' presumed extinction was when synapsids' steady decline and the ascent of the reptiles truly began. As the Triassic period progressed, synapsids made up less and less of the megafauna, and only small species survived into the Jurassic period. Still, Moschorhinus should not be seen as an evolutionary failure. Even though it doesn't seem to have survived long enough to see the Earth fully recover, it survived the most devastating mass extinction event despite its relatively large body size. Likewise, after hundreds of millions of years, some of today's top predators have reinvented its hunting strategy. With this in mind, much like its prey Lystrosaurus, Moschorhinus is among the most notable, if not famous, prehistoric creatures. Thank you for watching, and a thank you to Literally Miguel for creating illustrations specifically for this video. Also a thank you to my supporters on Patreon, who chose the subject of the video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the like button, and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. If you would like to support this channel more directly, you can join my Patreon, where you'll have access to polls to select the topics of future videos. Finally, be sure to have a great day.